Last night, sang some karaoke with some friends. And let me tell you, I think we should start a choir. We've got the people who can belt it out. I mean, we're not good, but what choirs are, I mean, there are some good choirs out there. I mean, my experience with, anyway, no, just kidding. Man, it's so good to see everybody here this morning. There's a lot to unpack today. I was kind of all over the place when preparing for the last couple of weeks for today. So I'm just going to kind of give an outline of what we're going to do, what to expect. So first, I'm going to talk about Jesus flipping tables, or as some of the other Bible translations call it, he's clearing the temple. Then we're going to talk about sin, and I'm going to share a little bit of a personal story. And after that, you're going to be in your heads thinking about your own sin, or you might be thinking about lunch. But then from there, we're going to look at the 10 Commandments and how they're part of this bigger metaphor of a wedding. And I'll probably get distracted in my head because I'll be thinking of my own wedding that's happening soon. You'll probably be wondering what this has to do with Jesus flipping tables. And that's when I'll call the kids down from the kids' hall. And then I'll go back to talking about sin and close it with a message of hope. And then we'll have communion together. So you ready? Okay. First, we're going to talk about Jesus flipping tables, or as some Bibles call it, Jesus clearing the temple. So back in the early 2000s, there's a church called Vintage 21. You can tell it was the early 2000s because of the name of said church. But they did a sermon series on who Jesus was and what he did. And part of this, they created this series of satirical videos where they did voiceovers of the classic Jesus movie, kind of depicting how people viewed him. And one of the videos showed Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount. He's standing on this hill, and he says, last impression here, "Look at all these sinners. All right, listen up. Listen to me. I'm Jesus. Listen to what I have to say. I've done many wonderful things. I've healed many people owed diseases. I've performed many miracles, so I can tell you this. You're all evil. There is no hope. That's it. Thank you." And I remember the first time we watched this video, we watched all of them, like at least a dozen times, just dying and laughing. It was like the entertainment if you went to a Christian college. So imagine my delight when I was looking at the lectionary reading for today and saw that one of the videos covered our passage. So we're going to watch one of these videos this morning. So let's check it out. Go ahead. It's funny, we laugh at these videos and they're absolutely ridiculous. But honestly, like, I think that's some of the mindset that I've at least had an experience in the church. It's like, it's so strict. You got to do these things. You got to follow the rules. You got to do these things in order to get into heaven or be considered a good Christian. But our lectionary reading today comes from John 2, 13 through 22. So if you read with me, we'll have it up on the screen. It says, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling the doves, 'Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' The Jews then said to him, 'What sign can you show us for doing this?' And Jesus answered, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said, 'This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus has spoken." You know, there's a lot that has been said about this passage of Jesus flipping tables and taking a whip and just whipping it around. A lot of it, some people said this really shows Christ's humanity, and he's got some very human reactions and emotions of anger. I've also heard it been used to like we shouldn't sell things at church, which was kind of weird. I've also heard that Jesus was mad because the priests were exploiting the poor and marginalized, driving up the costs of animals so that people couldn't make sacrifices, which I think that one's a little bit more accurate, but it's not quite there. So in Mark's account of this temple clearing, Jesus says, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." You see, Jesus isn't calling the temple a den of robbers because it's where the location of injustice and exploitation was happening. In the book, the last week, it says, a den is a hideaway, a safe house, a refuge. It's not where robbers rob, but where they flee for safety after having done their robbing elsewhere. The people's everyday injustice makes them robbers, and they think the temple is their safe house, den, hideaway, or place of security. The temple is not the place where the robbery occurs, but the place where the robbers go for refuge. So I pose this question. If Renovatus is a den, hideaway, a safe house, or a refuge, where are we seeking refuge from? The daily grind? Maybe we're seeking refuge from ourselves and just wanting to be a part of community, right? I feel like we should be a den. But let's make this question a little harder and more relevant to the passage. Are we making Renovatus a den of robbers? And so this is the part where I'm going to talk about sin, share a personal story. So I'm going to make an assumption here. I'm willing to bet that anybody who grew up in the church also had a secret sin that they thought was the thing that was keeping them from having a true relationship with God. Whether it was like their strong will or, I don't know, right? For me, I had the usual sins. I swore, occasionally cheated on a test, smoked the occasional cigarette, watched things on TV that I shouldn't. But the thing that I thought was sending me straight to hell was my sexuality. And I didn't think much about it until I was in college. I wasn't like high school. I wasn't really interested in any kind of relationship. I was just like, I want to play guitar in my room and like hang out at church all the time. Like that was my thing. But I went to this Christian college and this whole new world opened up and I was surrounded by Christianity. And I was like, this is awesome. This is exactly what I want. This is a dream. And I spent 5 years studying to become a youth pastor. And let's be honest, studying is a very loose term, hence the 5 years that it took me to get there. I took a semester off, okay? But then like my big secret started to grow inside of me because then I started noticing people and who I was attracted to. And towards the end, I developed feelings for someone. I developed feelings for a girl, and it was the most terrifying thing ever because I was afraid that I was going to ruin my future career and everything that I just worked so hard for. So after I graduated college, I moved back to New York, told the church that I had been going to that I was going to be their new youth pastor. And they were like, oh, okay. And so I just kind of made myself the youth pastor there. And then also worked a couple other jobs at the same time. But I was no longer in this like Christian bubble. So I had a lot more exposure to the world. And I'm meeting more people and developing crushes and, of course, normal things that people do. But I felt so much guilt and shame. I was like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And I was really frustrated that I just couldn't let it go. Felt like it had this like stronghold on me. And then I secretly dated someone and I hated myself for that. And I got to the point where I was willing to do whatever it took to get rid of this. So I prayed constantly for forgiveness and for a change of heart. I looked at some of those like get the gay out camps. I considered going to that or one of those. And I eventually opened up to a close friend. And I told her, I was like, I think I'm gay. And I'd never said that out loud. I was terrified. And it felt like I had to make this big decision between like God and my sexuality. And I wanted to lean into it and I wanted to explore it, but I was terrified because I didn't want to leave God. I didn't want to leave my faith. And it all came to a boiling point. And I was essentially forced to step down as youth pastor. So after that, I packed my car up with everything and moved back to South Carolina. And I thought maybe if I start fresh, like redo, I can do this again, and then it will go away for real this time. So I went to another church, got super involved, was like volunteering with the youth, and went on for a couple years. And guess what? This sin never went away. So this time, instead of running away, I just decided to lean into it. And I had no clue how my faith and sexuality would mesh, but I knew that I just couldn't continue to live in this vicious cycle. So why are we so hard on ourselves? Feels like a silly question. I know why I was hard on myself. I was told that I'm a dirty, rotten sinner. I was told that Christ died on the cross on my behalf, even though I didn't deserve it. And the guilt that comes with not being able to hold up your end of the bargain, that's heavy. And I believe that I was making the church a den of robbers, giving into sin during the week and then going to church on Sunday as if everything was fine. Now I'm going to talk about the 10 Commandments. And you're probably thinking about lunch. Exodus 19 says, I am the Lord, then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make an idol you shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is under the water, or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. I listened to this podcast. If you are a podcast listener and you really want to get into deep into scripture from the Jewish perspective, I recommend Bema, Bema. I've only been able to find it on the Apple Podcasts. But I listened to an episode recently and they talked about the 10 Commandments. And in this episode, they talked about ancient Eastern weddings. And so weddings were like a huge ordeal then. Probably still are now over there and here. But what it looked like, so like a man, and it was like an arranged marriage as well. But it wasn't like a father and mother would be like, this is who you're marrying. Like the man went to some party, whatever, and be like, oh yes, I like her. And then the family would be like, yeah, she seems great. And so then he kind of like chooses and gives her what's called the cup of the covenant, which is the betrothal. And essentially meant you're the one. Do you accept this rose? And the groom would leave to prepare the house. And no one knew how long this would take, not even the groom. It was the groom's father who would come in and deem like the house is ready. And then you can go get your bride. So it could take days, it could weeks, it could take months, it could take years, just no idea how long. So there could be this really long period of like, oh, I just got engaged and I have no idea where this guy is. I don't know this guy. And he's like, I don't know, putting electrical outlets in the house, and dad doesn't think it's good enough. And then finally, the father of the groom would come in and be like, okay, this house is ready. You may go get your bride. And so then he goes and he gets his bride, and the bride is consecrated. The shofar is sounded, which is like the horn, like, and they gather under the huppah, which is like this canopy situation, and they have like their ceremony. And then there's a presentation of the ketubah. Now, the ketubah is a covenant prepared by the groom, kind of like vows, I guess. But there's usually 7, 10, 12 items that the groom is basically saying, this is the foundation of the relationship. These are the main tenets that I want to build our marriage upon. And in the ancient world, the bride wasn't part of this making of the ketubah, but she had the ability to reject or accept it. But then there was a consummation of the wedding, exchanging of gifts, and then an entire honeymoon year. The man wouldn't work, and they just spent the first year just getting to know each other because they didn't know each other. They just got married, and they're like, well, I guess we should date. And if we look back at chapter 9, right before this passage, you think, what does this have to do with the Ten Commandments? Right before this passage in chapter 19, it says, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. And all the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, this is said when they get to Mount Sinai and God is ready to give them the Ten Commandments. And God is essentially saying, I want to enter into a special relationship with you. And the wording that is used here in chapter 19 is unique. And it is specific when he says, if you agree to enter into the covenant, it's specific. That's like blatant wedding language, right? It's not just like this treasure possession is like specifically used only for wedding language. And he says here, God says, if you will agree to enter into the covenant, there's no demand. God already rescued them out of Egypt. It wasn't like, if you agree to this, then I'll rescue you out of Egypt. He rescues them from Egypt, gets them to Mount Sinai, and then he says, here's the deal. I'd like to be in a special covenant with you as a nation. And if you're in, and if you say yes, then you will be my treasure possession. So if we go all the way back to Genesis, and we can see this whole pattern of a wedding, right? We have the betrothal when he calls Abram to leave his family, to leave his father's house and go to a new land. And then the groom leaves to prepare the house, and that's when they're in this time of Egypt. And then there's the arrival of the bridegroom, where we have the story of the Passover. And then the bride is consecrated, and God tells Moses God tells Moses to consecrate Israel. And then the shofar is sounded, which is the sound of shofar at Sinai. And then they gather under the huppah, which is the cloud covering the mountain. And then there's the presentation of the ketubah, which is the Ten Commandments. And then the consummation of the wedding, which we have our tabernacle, and the exchanging of wedding gifts, which is the law, which that sounds not like a gift. And then the honeymoon year, which is a time of wandering in the wilderness. So God said to Israel, I want to establish a covenant with you, and I'll show you that I'm not like the other gods who other nations worship. So if we go back to the ketubah, the Ten Commandments here, you have 2 tablets, one for the bride, one for the groom. They got these 10 things on them, and God's saying, this is what I want. This is what I want to define our relationship. This is the starting place. This is the foundation. And all of a sudden, we no longer have this list of commands or rules that we have to follow to avoid judgment or punishment. Rather, we have God saying, don't hurt yourself, protect others, take care of each other. Trust that I will provide. But unfortunately, these stories have been used as a weapon against us. In 1741, Jonathan Edwards preached a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I've never read this sermon. But the sermon is an appeal to sinners to recognize that they will be judged by God, and that this judgment will be more fearful and more painful than they can comprehend. While, like I said, I've never read this, and while I've never read it, it's evident that this sermon has highly influenced our view of God in the modern evangelical world. Boy, is it so wrong. We can call the kids down. I'm going to go back to talking about sin. The Greek word for sin is translated literally as missing the mark. We look at the Greek. And I think we spend the majority of our developing years trying to figure out what the heck is considered sin and what's not. What if I sin by accident? I didn't mean to do that. Oops. Now what? But sin is so complicated. And to talk about sin is even more complicated. I'm reading this book by Patrick O'Toomey called In the Shelter. Don't ask me what it's about because I can't remember. But in it, he says, sin, in the words of James Allison, is an addiction to being less than ourselves. In order then to make sense of sin, we need to make sense of ourselves. And in order to make sense of ourselves, we need to reckon with the powerful possibility that ourselves are of value. Not just for a distant redeemed potential that exists like a taunting promise of what might, but will probably never be. We're not dirty. We're not rotten sinners. We're just sinners. We're human. We're made in the image of God and we have value. So maybe my biggest sin wasn't that I'm gay. Maybe my biggest sin was that I saw myself as invaluable and unlovable because of who I wanted. Maybe the whole time I was fighting and trying to pray the gay away, God was fighting and pleading with me to stop listening to the voices around me and to love myself just as I am. I was chatting with Erin last night about this, and she brought up Samson in the Bible. Samson did a lot of shady stuff, but he wasn't called out until he stopped being true to who he was and how he did himself. Patrick writes in this book, sin has two rebellious daughters, language and hope. Language to confess the awful truth and hope that we might move, however slowly, toward change. If we were to tell a story of sin, and our experience shows us that we will always be missing the mark of our best selves, we must tell this story in the context of the confession, the story of our lives. To confess our sin means we're sharing our lives with each other. We're being vulnerable. We're not tearing ourselves and each other down, wallowing in guilt and shame. But we're seeing the value in ourselves and in each other. And to confess our sins means we're saying yes to God and the type of relationship that's laid out in the ketubah. And so we have hope. What is hope? Hope is a song sung when everything else says you shouldn't be singing. And even though we keep getting it wrong, and we will continue to get it wrong, hope is what helps us survive. Pray with me. Lord, as we close this time together, we seek your guidance and comfort. Help us embrace our true selves, find hope in your love. Grant us the courage to confess our sins, be vulnerable, and see the value in ourselves and others. May we walk in the light of your grace and spread hope wherever we go.